Hello, this video is about the Germany exam. It's a walking, talking mock that will help you to understand how to answer the questions. Firstly, what questions do we have to answer? Well, this is a 1 hour 20 exam and it's worth 52 marks. There's quite a few questions, there are 6. The first one is an infer question where you've got to read between the lines, work something out from a source. Second one, our old friend, explain why. 3 paragraphs, point, evidence, explain. Third one, how useful are sources B and C for inquiry into something? And that is worth 8 marks, and that is 2 paragraphs, CAP, content, author, purpose. Next up, what is the difference between the 2 interpretations? 4 marks. Then, suggest 1 reasons why the interpretations give different views, which is, as we know, a very easy question, but we need to remember how to do it, which we'll go through in a minute. Then finally, how far do you agree with interpretation 2, which is a great question, and you can get good marks on it, but you've just got to make sure you're following the format. Here we go. So we're going to look at this 2019 exam paper, and we did this in our mock, but we're just going through it now because I think it's useful to think about how we do this. So the first thing we've got to do is got to make sure that we look at the question before we look at the source. Give 2 things you can infer from source A about the early development of the Nazi Party. I would use a highlighter. I'd highlight early development of the Nazi Party, and I'd think about that word development. What does it mean? It means something to do with the party growing, the party getting bigger. And then I'd start to read the source, and I would focus mostly on the stuff in the box rather than who wrote it. I introduced all my army friends to the German Workers' Party. This was how we built up the movement in the early days. Okay, so that seems to be with early development because the party is growing. So what can I infer about why the party is growing? Well, the party is growing because people who were acquaintances of Ernst Röhm, as it says at the top, Ernst Röhm were invited to join the party. How can I, that's what I can infer. And then details in the source that tell me this. I introduced all my army friends to the German Workers' Party. I think a better one is from the next paragraph. In February 1920, the party presented its policies to the public for the first time in the 25-point program. From that day on, the party membership began to increase. Okay, well, that seems like a better one for me because I don't want to just paraphrase. I don't want to just say what it says in the source. So I can make an inference here, a proper one. So I can infer that the 25-point program was popular with the German people. And the details in the source that tell me this, from that day on, the party membership began to increase. Makes sense. That I do that twice, and as a result, I've got myself 4 marks. Now, explain why the Nazis were able to create a police state in the years 1933 to 39. Now, this is so important in an exam that you're actually thinking about these words before you just start writing, even before you start bulleting out what you think might be answers. You've got to think about what the question is asking and what those key words in it are. So police state. So I've got to think about what police state is. I've got to kind of also avoid being too distracted by the words in the box, because those are evidence which may or may not be useful. But first I've got to think for myself, or else I'm going to get stuck with rubbish answers really that are just me saying those words and adding a little bit of detail to that. So I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to think about the police state. I think about, okay, well, they were able to create a police state. Well, what is the police state? Well, the police state is when everyone is afraid because the police are in control. And that suddenly makes things easier for me. So why was it that the Nazis, everyone was afraid of the Nazis? Well, I know this. Because of the Gestapo. I think we all hopefully know because of the Gestapo, they created a secret police, informants, all the rest of it that we could then add in. Hopefully details like there's only 30,000 members of the Gestapo, but so many informants meant that they were able to create fear amongst the populace. If you've got better subject knowledge, you can also include in that paragraph the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, who were responsible for spying on political opponents. And that is then a great paragraph, but it's a good paragraph even on the Gestapo. Another quite easy paragraph, I think, for us is the concentration camps. They're able to create a police state in the years 1933 to 39 because they created concentration camps. And then you give me the details, the number 150,000 in 1939, and you explain why that meant that people were so afraid and the police state was able to be put into effect. And then next thing I'd know about the police state is that in a police state, the Nazis or whoever's in charge are above the law. So how are they above the law? Well, they were above the law because the people who were meant to be following the law weren't. They were allowing the Nazis off if they did something wrong, and they were treating others much more harshly. The judges would be a good answer. The Nazis were able to keep a police state in the years 1933 to 39 because they had the judges under their control. Now, I want to use evidence. I want to talk about the organisation that was set up for the maintenance of law, which meant that if I was a judge, I had to essentially follow Nazi rules and do essentially what the Nazis wanted me to do, or else I would lose my job. Those would be my 3 paragraphs. And I've got those really from thinking about police state, working out what it means, and then coming up with my points from that. Now, the next question is to do with sources, and all the rest of the questions are on sources and interpretations. This one is the useful question. How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into Nazi policies towards women? Now, again, we've got to look at the question. So it would be easy to just write this whole thing about women, to write about the experience of women. This question is not really about the experience of women, it's about what Nazis wanted women to do. A policy is a plan. So I've got to be up thinking, what did the Nazis want women to do? And before I even start looking at the source, I'd be thinking in my head, maybe writing some notes, what did the Nazis want women to do? Well, we know that the Nazis wanted women to have children. So how did they do that? Well, oh yeah, they created the law for the encouragement of marriage. What else did they do? Oh yeah, they gave them medals. They gave them the mother's crosses to encourage them to have children. What else did they do? Well, I could think, okay, when they were younger, up to the age of 21, they encouraged women to join the League of German Maidens because they wanted to teach them about racial hygiene so that they married the right person and had children with them. And I've got quite a lot of things that I could now write about. I need to kind of then look at the source. And in this sort, when I look at this source, I am much more interested about who wrote it. It says from a speech made by Joseph Goebbels, and I would highlight that, and I would write that I know who Goebbels is. He's the Minister of Propaganda, and you must have that level of subject knowledge. You must know some of these basic people. And then I've got a mark or two already when I look later on at the author and purpose. Then he's saying German women, German men, the birth rate in Germany is rapidly declining, so a major change is needed. Okay, let's keep going. We believe that German women must use their strength and abilities in different areas from men. So this seems to start connecting with what I know about the Nazi policies. Let me say this clearly. The first, best, and most suitable place for the woman is in the family. Okay, and it goes on in pretty much the same spirit. Um, how useful is source B? Well, source B is useful for inquiry into Nazi policies towards women because it focuses on women's role being at home. Super simple. Now I need a quote that suggests that that is what they thought was the role of women. And there's plenty of these. And it says here, it is her most glorious duty to give children to her people and nation. And now I'm going to say, how does that connect with what I know? Well, this fits with what I know because the Nazis created policies such as the law for the encouragement of marriage in 1933, which meant that women received a loan when they were married and they didn't have to pay it back if they had 4 or more children. And if I'm feeling like I really want to go for it, I might add another quote. The best place for the woman to serve her family is in her marriage, in the family, in motherhood. And this fits with what I know because the Nazis were obsessed with this idea of creating a Third Reich, which was this idea of a Germany that would last 1,000 years, but they needed women to have more children to make that possible. And so they created endless propaganda to sell that story to women. Then I would do the next thing, which is look at the author, and I'd look at the purpose of the source. The source is also useful because it was written by Joseph Goebbels, who was the Minister of Propaganda at the time. And I maybe combine it with purpose. And I would say, and this speech was given in order to make women feel that they were valued if they were to fulfill this Nazi role of having children. And if I were to do all of that, I would get 8 marks if I did that for both of those sources. Next up, study interpretations 1 and 2. They give different views about Nazi policies towards women. What is the main difference between these views? Well, I'm going to have to read them. And I'm going to have to read them and then think about what is the difference between these two. They're both contemporary writers, so writers from now. So I don't need to know who wrote them, I just need to read them. So let's look at the first one. The Nazis' attempts to drive women back into the home were not particularly successful. In fact, the number of women in all types of jobs increased, mainly due to the work opportunities created by the economic recovery. Okay, I could keep going on, but this source, this interpretation, is basically saying that the Nazis were not successful in their policies because most women went to work. Let's look at the next one. Interpretation 2. Hitler was very clear that women should bring up children at home while their husbands worked. Okay, and it goes on like that. So this interpretation is very different. I can see that the first interpretation seems to be saying that the Nazi policy towards women of encouraging them to have children was not really a success. The Nazis failed in their policies towards women. How do I know that? Well, it says because the Nazis' attempts to drive women back into the home were not particularly successful. On the other hand, interpretation 2 is saying Hitler was very clear that women should bring up children at home. It keeps going on. By 1939, very few women were in full-time work. So, however, interpretation 2 suggests that the Nazis were very successful in encouraging women to stay at home. And the quote, by 1939, very few women were in full-time work. So I've got myself 4 out of 4. How? I just talked about interpretation 1, what it's about, added a quote, and then I've done the same for interpretation 2. I haven't written very much, but I've just got enough to get the marks. Then, this question, which a lot of people seem to struggle on, although it's actually, if you know what to do, the easiest question really on the paper, suggests one reason why interpretations 1 and 2 give different views about Nazi policies towards women. Well, it looks like it's the same as the question before, which is why people get it wrong. But actually, this one's asking you why. Why did these two writers, these two historians, have such different views about Nazi policies towards women? One thought they were a success, one thought they were a failure. How can that be? And it gives you a clue what you're meant to do. You may use sources B and C to help explain your answer. Well, actually, you must use those sources, and you write it like this. You remember this structure. The writer of interpretation 1, remind ourselves, interpretation 1 is Nazis' attempts to drive women back into the work were not particularly successful. Women were working. Okay, is similar to which of those two sources, source B or source C? Well, source C is a factory, whereas source B is Nazi propaganda saying women should stay at home. So the writer of interpretation 1 may have seen sources like source C as they are both about women working during when the Nazis were in power. However, the writer of interpretation 2 may have seen sources like source B because they're both about women being encouraged to stay at home and have children. Next up, I've got this final question, this 16 marker, which is reasonably straightforward if you've done the questions before it and you've been thinking about the key terms. So we understand this question is about Nazi policies towards women. So how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about Nazi policies towards women? What you do is you agree with interpretation 2, you sum it up, so go back to it. Interpretation 2, Hitler was very clear that women should bring up children at home while their husband worked. Okay, So we're reminding ourselves of this source, and we sum it up. I partly agree with interpretation about Nazi policies towards women, because it says that the Nazis focused on getting women to stay at home and have children. Then it had a quote to do with Nazi policies towards children. Okay, we go back and we can say it says, for example, that 80,000 couples accepted loans offers as part of the law for the encouragement of marriage. And you would say then, this fits with what I know, because the law for encouragement of marriage provided a loan that was almost a year's pay, and you didn't have to pay it back if you had 4 children. So I'm adding in more. And this also fits with what I know, because the Nazis not just did this, but they also created Mother's Cross, which you gained if you were a woman and you had sufficient numbers of children to gain the Gold Cross, 8 children, and so on. And that connects because they're both about trying to encourage women to have children. So I can connect that with my own subject knowledge. I do that again for that source if I can, for that interpretation if I can. If I can't, I move on. I do the same for interpretation 1. And once I've done that, I then am ready to answer the question, which interpretation do you more agree with and why? And again, you've got to come with a conclusion. Do you think that the Nazi policies towards women were successful, or do you think they were a failure? And you have to say to what extent you think they were a success or a failure on their terms. They wanted primarily women to have children. So did they succeed in achieving that? Perhaps they did for part of the time, but they didn't do it for all of the time, in which case that could be your answer. And we heard that in class. Okay, that's it. Please make sure that you've taken a few notes, I hope, as you've gone along. Maybe you look at another exam paper now so that you really understand exactly how to do this paper when you are in the exam and are perfectly ready for it. All the best. Bye bye.